I thought COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials were anemic. I thought those weren't sufficient. But in fact, as compared to the clinical trials for most childhood vaccines, that actually was an incredible clinical trial. You can't compare a recombinant DNA vaccine to an attenuated vaccine to a subunit vaccine to a toxoid vaccine. They're very, very different. We represent one of the families of those children, and we have all the medical records. We reviewed them, and I can tell you categorically, measles did not kill one of those children. That is just false. It was hospital negligence. It was not measles based on the medical records. The killed child had already had measles. It was over, and we're putting together a write-up. The medical professionals that reviewed it, and it's going to be published. Put out there in some publication. Vaccines are the only product in the United States, the only one that has immunity for what they call design defect claims, which is the claim that you could have made the product safer, and had you done so, I wouldn't have been injured, which is the primary claim you would bring for if you're injured by a product.
I'm honored today to have with us Aaron Siri. He's an attorney at Siri and Glibstad, and he was recently on the Senate hearing with Senators Ron Johnson and Blumenthal and so forth. He'll tell us what the name of that hearing was. Performed incredibly admirably. Probably, almost by an order of magnitude, one of the more articulate, polished, thorough people you'll ever come across. I like the line you have that you don't necessarily have the credentials of some of the scientists and so forth, PhDs and whatnot, and so you have to work a little bit harder. So tell us, you have worked, I believe, with MAHA and CHD, Children's Health Defense, and with RFK Jr. In his campaign and so forth. Tell us how you got there, what your role is, what's the direction, what's your focus, and what do you hope to see, change in our, say, health prospective and prospectus?
Sure. Well, first, our firm represents ICANN primarily. That's the nonprofit in the space that represent the Informed Consent Action Network. CHD is a great organization, different organization that Bobby was counsel for. And obviously, I've also represented Mr. Kennedy before he was Secretary Kennedy, including on the campaign trail. My focus when it comes to vaccines is about individual and civil rights. It's that, look, if you want to get a vaccine, this is America, that's freedom. You should be free to get as many as you want. You should be able to wear as many masks as you want and live in your basement forever and self-quarantine. That's freedom, that's America. I support your right to do that. But if you do not want to get a vaccine, right, you've been informed, you've looked at it, and you've decided, I don't want to consent, that's informed consent. If you then coerce over that by requiring it, then you've destroyed informed consent. That's what dictators, bullies, thugs, and so forth do. When government can't persuade you on the merits, they resort to censorship, coercion, thuggery, bullying, you name it, all the worst forms of government throughout history. And that's my view of mandates. And so what we do is we fight primarily for the right for individual and civil rights when it comes to the medical products. And that also includes addressing claims without safety and efficacy, because they use the claim it's safe and effective to mandate them. And hence that makes that claim no longer just a medical issue, but it makes it a legal and a political issue. They say, stop politicizing vaccines. I agree. Stop mandating them. Then you take them out of politics.
So I'm reading your book, Vaccines, Amen. And you talk about the religious aspect. I've researched autism. I try to pretend I'm the child in the Emperor's New Clothes. I come upon medical issues, and I've got the little MD on my end of my name. Toby Rogers thinks it's a trade, kind of a captured world, and maybe. But I went so long ago, we didn't even have the word autism in medical school back then. I graduated in 1981. And I mean, maybe, but probably not. We never got lectured on that topic. So there's been a lot of drift on that topic. And we also didn't have the same number of vaccines, and I grew up as a child, believe it or not, like many of us. I was a child once, and we had chickenpox parties, we had measles parties, we had German measles party, and we had to speak German all the while. Anyway, yet we survived. I mean, if you call this surviving, I'm wondering, what's the brave new world, figuratively, to which we would be entering, and are there kind of counterfactual examples in other nations where they don't have the mandates and so forth? And I'll just put out this one thing, what I call the zombie apocalypse exclusion. If there were a zombie apocalypse virus, Ebola mixed in with HIV, and it's aerosolized, and a little bit of anthrax mixed in, and we're all going to drop dead, and it's communicable, blah blah blah. Some zombie apocalypse comes in. Should we have the right to mandate everybody's being vaccinated? And when we fall short of that with, say, I don't know, Gardasil, what is that about?
All right, I'll address all three of those points. First, in the early 1980s, there were only 3 routine vaccines: MMR, OPV, and DTP, and the uptake of those in the population were about the high 50s, low 60%. That's it. And was there a zombie apocalypse then? No. And like you pointed out, you had all these parties to get these febrile childhood infections, which study after study show, by the way, those that have had measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox have lower rates of cancer and far lower rates of heart disease. And those are statistically significant in the studies that have looked at that issue. Inconvenient findings, inconvenient studies, but they're all right there in PubMed to be had, and they're consistent. Second point you brought up, which was about, will there be apocalypse if there are no mandates? Most provinces in Canada have no mandates. Apocalypse? No. Australia has no mandates. Apocalypse? No. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, no mandates. Apocalypse? No. I can go through a lot more countries. I'll stop there. As for your last question about, the hypothetical infectious disease that kills 90% of people it affects. Well, first of all, let's put aside, basic virology, that obviously a virus wants to be able to continue to transmit. So it doesn't want to kill its host. Otherwise it doesn't transmit. Yeah. And also it wants its host out of bed and circulating so it can't transmit. Let's just put facts aside and imagine this hypothetical, world in which the virulence just continues forever until it kills everybody and it kills itself, which viruses typically don't try to do. They don't try to kill themselves. Anyway, in this hypothetical counterfactual world, here's the deal. No mandate still. And I'll tell you why. If you got a virus killing 90% of people and you still can't persuade people to take that vaccine, let me tell you something. You about to have some real issues with that vaccine. Because if 90% people who get this virus are dying and you can't persuade them, come on, you can't be serious. And don't tell me the vaccine doesn't work if I don't get it in my arm, if it doesn't get into your arm, because that's just magical thinking.
No, that's very well said. I can't tell you how many of my cohort of physicians, and I run across them, medically and then socially and whatnot, just don't really get that concept. I actually have I think in analogies, and I don't know what disease that was, but I see like COVID as a wolf, and it comes in from zoonotically, comes in from the wild like a wolf might, and wolves don't care about your kids. Whisk one off, the dingo ate my baby kind of thing. You might be too young for that. Anyway, that's that. But then we have schnauzers and poodles and whatnot who don't do that. They've been domesticated. So SARS and, classic Coke, SARS and SARS-2 are like the wolves. They come in, they don't have any human encounter historically. They're a new thing. They're proto-wolf, as it were. And then over time, all our dogs were also, wolves at one point, and they become domesticated. They don't want to kill us. They want to feed off us. And that's what most of your common cold viruses, of which coronavirus is the number 2 most commonly named cause. And so we've entered a world where that is what coronavirus is now. And ever since Omicron, which is probably not a distinct lineal descendant from SARS-CoV-2, we entered a world where we have poodles and schnauzers as coronaviruses, and yet still there's a mandate for those, and people are just kind of forcing them. It's just to speak to the COVID issue per se. It seems like a lot of the vaccine hesitancy people have now is because there was vaccine, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, overkill during the COVID era. I wonder what your perspective is on that.
I would say the reason you have vaccine hesitancy now is mostly the result of the way public health authorities conducted themselves. And by conducting themselves in the manner that they did, folks started looking under the hood. And when they did, what they realized was, ooh, wait a second. I thought COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials were anemic. I thought those weren't sufficient. But in fact, as compared to the clinical trials for most childhood vaccines, that actually was an incredible clinical trial. It had an average 2 months of placebo control group. It had 30 to 42,000 people, depending on Moderna or Pfizer. It reviewed safety for 6 months. In comparison, oh my goodness, I just learned, and this was what's happening, that, for example, the 2 hepatitis B vaccines given to newborn infants, one of them, the first one licensed, was licensed based for children, based on a clinical trial with 147 kids, 5 days of safety monitoring after injection, and no control group. The other one had 4 days of safety monitoring. And when parents see that, they go, wait a second. Whoa. You told me this is the most robustly trialed and safety tested product ever. It creates cognitive dissonance because the health authorities, they're not being honest with you about this claim of the most robustly trialed and the most robustly studied product. The COVID vaccine, I have never seen a vaccine that has undergone, that is the best, in terms of, that is probably the most robust clinical trial of any vaccine. And in terms of post-licensure safety review, there is no vaccine with as much post-licensure safety review as COVID vaccine, as far as I'm aware. Go take a look through PubMed. The post-licensure safety for most childhood vaccines is anemic, certainly in comparison. So with that said, as they look under the hood, they start questioning. They start saying, wait, I do want informed consent. I want to consent after I'm informed, but I can't be informed with that clinical trial and with what I see in these IOM reviews. So I think that it's two things. I think first, the public health authorities lost the trust of Americans by the way that they acted. Their bullying, their mandates, their coercion, their often reality and logic defying approaches that then got parents to start looking under the hood. And in many ways, part of why I wrote my book is to help parents get what do the primary sources say, try to put that all together in one place.
Well, you did a very nice job. I haven't not finished your book, but I'm reading your book, Vaccines, Amen. And I recommend people buy it, A, to support you in your work, B, to read it, and C, theoretically, to act upon it. I have to admit, I was rather stunned. First of all, I'm in your debt, and you'll get a check in the mail, I guess, but I'm in your debt for the Stanley Plotkin interview. Because I try to take things from null hypothesis. I've written a book, Overturning Zika, and I try to take, nothing tacitly. I try to investigate whether Zika actually caused microcephaly. Everyone wonders why it disappeared. Maybe we'll get to that later. And it's a interesting question. So I wrote a book, Overturning Zika. Zika is real. Microcephaly is real. In my view, one has nothing to do with the other, and that's that. And nobody's really looked at it that way. But in your book, when I was taking kind of the same approach to autism, which is we have a huge epidemic of autism. I feel like, well, what is autism? What's it? I don't want to go too far into it. Dr. Malone, Robert Malone, was kind enough to repost my Unraveling Autism's Surge, and he says it's like the longest treatise he's ever put out, but it's a comprehensive look at what it is. I feel like you have to identify the thing. And while I was doing that, I came upon your work, and your deposition of Stanley Plotkin was, eye-opening. It's just unbelievable. I don't really want to, take the view that all of medical school is captured, but, we just worked on the assumption that these things are very well researched. And maybe I'll just put it up for our viewers, if I can for a minute. This is from my autism article. In 1969, Dr. Stanley Plotkin, who's really I don't know what you want to call him,
He's the world's leading vaccinologist.
thank you.
And inventor
He
of
published a
numerous
rubella
vaccines.
vaccine trial explicitly involving mentally retarded and orphan children test subjects. Anyway, when he was deposed, he recalled his 1959 Congo Fieldworks town names, but he couldn't remember testing on the mentally handicapped. And there's another issue, which is implicit in my autism article about defining what it is that in Africa, they don't really consider autism a thing. I mean, they're not really developed enough to have, kind of separate people on this cognitive basis, because it's more of a manual labor thing, especially at that time, 1950s and whatnot. People are, digging in the mines or in the fields or whatever. And so, he used people that don't really have the same parameters of what we might notice for side effects here. So the studies were just not all that. And I'm just wondering whether, that's across the board, and what were the kind of basics. We're taught in medical school and beyond, I guess, that the randomized double-blind, trial is the gold standard. How much of that have we seen, for viruses and, vaccines per se?
I could tell you categorically, and I lay it out in detail in chapter 10 of my book. I go through every single routine injected childhood vaccine. I cite directly to the FDA clinical trial documents, because that's how you know what was relied upon to license them. And I can tell you categorically that not a single routine injected vaccine on the CDC childhood schedule was licensed based on a clinical trial where the control group received something inert, meaning a placebo. That is the definition of a placebo, something inert. Not only that, I can also tell you categorically that they never received as a control another vaccine, because you could do that. You could use another vaccine as a control if that vaccine had been licensed based on a properly sized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of sufficient duration. I could tell you not a single one of those vaccines, when they were used as a control, was licensed based on a clinical trial where the control group received something inert. So I could tell you categorically, none of them were licensed based on a placebo-controlled and inert controlled trial, either directly or down the chain. Now, that's not where the problem stops, because look, even if you had a control group that received a placebo, well, now you still need to review safety long enough. If I have a placebo group, but I review safety for 5 days, that's useless. So you still need a safety review period that's long enough. And even if you have that, that's still not good enough. You still need to have it to have properly powered. You need enough kids in it to detect if there's an issue. So not only is it not placebo controlled, I can tell you this, most of them have safety periods that are laughable, days or weeks. At most, they get to 6 months typically. And if that weren't enough, most of them are just underpowered. They don't have enough kids in them. So the clinical trials relied upon to license routine injectable vaccines. Not a single one of them was sufficient to actually validate the safety of those products before they went into the arms of millions, and our government went and touted them and promoted them to everybody in the public. Not a single one. There is one non-routine that did. That was a dengue vaccine, by the way, that reviewed safety for 5 years with a placebo control. You know what they found along the way? Younger children actually ended up with negative efficacy. They were dying at a higher rate. So it's not recommended for them. And they also found that if you hadn't had dengue yet and you got the vaccine, it made it worse. You were more likely to suffer adverse events. And so it's only recommended for older kids and only if you've already had dengue. That's it. If that trial was like all the other trials and it was not properly, not a placebo control, not long enough, they never would have found those issues most likely. And it would have been routine recommended for everybody. Kids would have been dying at higher rates. And it would have been said that anybody who said that the vaccine caused that death is just anti-science. It's just, it just hates vaccines. It's just whatever. You pick your pejorative.
So two things come to mind. First of all, again, devil's advocate. Can we, in some sense, say that, okay, fine, skateboards come out. When I was a kid, skateboards came out. And then the Razor scooters come out. Now we have electric scooters. And we don't go through huge safety trials for those things, but we can kind of see what happens. So I don't know, some, electric scooter, they maybe blow up, and I don't know, we notice, we kind of like in process, we capture these things and figure it out. We eat it, churn it, spit it out, whatever. So some things stay, some things don't. I guess, Ralph Nader got, what was it? The Pinto or something like that, maybe validly or not. I don't know. And so we kind of, societally, hairball cough out some objects and so forth. Can we say at this point that since, I don't know, the MMR has been around X duration of time, that ipso facto, people didn't, they're not, growing a third eye or whatever, can we ipso facto say those are safe? I mean,
absolutely not. And I'll directly address the two different ways. First of all, you can't compare a recombinant DNA vaccine to an attenuated vaccine, to a subunit vaccine, to a toxoid vaccine. They're very, very different. The very first, for example, recombinant DNA vaccine, I don't want to get into the underlying mechanisms, how you develop it, but that's a totally different product. It's just a different product. The very first recombinant DNA technology vaccine in the world ever, in America ever, was the hepatitis B vaccine, Recombavax HB, that I discussed earlier, with 147 kids and 5 days safety monitoring. That's the very first one ever. There's no precedent for that vaccine of its kind at all. There's nothing to reference back to. There was a vaccine for Hep B that preceded it from 1981 that they used the blood, the serum of those who were chronically infected with hepatitis B. Nobody wanted to take it. It was really only licensed for kids for infants that were born to hepatitis B positive mothers. So it wasn't even licensed for the same age group.
Did it come with or without HIV?
That's a whole, nobody wanted it. And like, look, and there's real reason to look at these things carefully. You know that in 1980, there were around 300 deaths in America from Hep B. Today, you're around 1,700 deaths from hepatitis B based on the CDC data. So hepatitis B deaths have skyrocketed. Let's not get into it. I'm going to stick to your point. No, you cannot analogize from one vaccine to another. They're all different. You shouldn't analogize mRNA technology to recombinant DNA or to attenuated. I'm going to specifically use your example of MMR. Now, if you look at MMR vaccine, absolutely not. It was never validated as safe. The current MMR vaccine was licensed in 1978, okay? What was the clinical trial? It had about 800 kids in it. That's it. 42 days of safety review, no control group. In those 42 days, a third of the kids had gastrointestinal issues. A third of the kids had respiratory issues. No control group, of course, it's safe because what are you comparing it against? You don't know. Fast forward to the next MMR vaccine license, which is the GSK version that came out a few years ago. So finally, you had a clinical trial that reviewed safety for 6 months. What was the control? Merck's MMR vaccine. So Merck's MMR, which had never been properly trialed, was the control against the new GSK MMR. 6 months of safety review. What did they find? They found, around 2% total between those with serious adverse events, new onset chronic health conditions, and serious reactions otherwise, about 10% of kids in both groups, healthy babies, healthy infants, toddlers, had one of these serious conditions, within 6 months. But because it's not normal for 10% of kids to have that within 6 months, they're otherwise healthy. But because the rate in those two groups were the same, for the FDA purposes, that's safe. For thinking, reasoning, rational, caring people, not safe. FDA standard, safe. Now, you can't make assumptions about safety, and it's too important to get this right. You're going to give a product to healthy infants, right? And then to your last comment about, third eyes aren't growing. Third eyes aren't the issue. Chronic health disease is the issue. We've gone from under 10%, and there's a lot of murky data around this, but in my book, I cite to a number of studies. You've gone from under 10% of kids with a chronic health issue in the 1980s to now well over 40%, depending on what data you look at. Secretary Kennedy said CDC's recent analysis is over 70%. In any event, it's skyrocketed. And what conditions have gone through the roof? Most of them have a basis of immune system dysregulation. Even things people don't think about as being immune mediated, like ADHD. Look at the PubMed literature. ADHD, for example, is based on an immune system related dysfunction, according to a whole host of studies. Cite that in my book too. And so when you look at that and you say, wait a second, most of these chronic health issues that have gone up are have an etiology and immune system dysregulation. Shouldn't we start by looking at the product that we've gone from on the CDC schedule in the early 1980s, 3 injections by 1 year of age, 3, to today, 29 injections by 1 year of age. That is an important thing to look at. There is no history of safety that you can relate to. If anything, if you want to go to history, then let's look at what came out before 1986, the 1986 Act that had to give manufacturers immunity for these products. It was widespread harm, so much so that for the few vaccines then, they needed immunity to liability on the basis that, claiming design defect claims.
So, when you say the three vaccines given, I mean, there were for 7 illnesses, correct?
Well, I count. I mean, listen, you can count them lots of different ways, right? You can count them based on, is Prevnar 13 vaccines because it's got 13 different, is Gardasil 9? Is it 1? I do it based on injection because it's the easiest way to do it. Right. MMR is 1 injection, DTP is 1 injection, OPV was a drop in the mouth. So I call it, by 1 year of age back then, you would have gotten 3 injections of DTP. Today, I still count MMR as 1, DTaP as 1, HIB as 1, IPV is 1. I can go down the whole list, but I'm not going to. So that's the way I count it. I mean, yeah, you could, if you want to count them separately, you can, but you can't get diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis as individual shots. So I go to the lowest common denominator when I count shots. I do it by injection.
So speaking to measles, I mean, the scare tactic, I believe, is, measles deaths. They're growing in Texas. They're growing here. They're growing there. What's up with that? What do you think is going on?
Sure, I can address that. Well, first of all, let me address the 2 children that they say died in measles in Texas. Number one, we represent one of the families of those children, and we have all the medical records. We reviewed them, and I can tell you categorically, measles did not kill one of those children. That is just false. It was hospital negligence. It was not measles based on the medical records. The killed child had already had measles. It was over. And we're putting together a write-up, the medical professionals that reviewed it, and it's going to be published. Put out there in some publication. The other child, we did not look at we did not represent that family, but there has been a write-up of that second child that died of measles, that they, claimed died of measles, and that medical professional that reviewed the medical records also said that child didn't die of measles. Look, here's what I could tell you about measles mortality. I will say measles vaccine, because it can prevent transmission, can certainly prevent measles deaths. If you can prevent transmission, of course it can do that. But that's not where the story ends. From 1900 to 1963, measles mortality in America went down by over 98%. There was no measles vaccine, it had nothing to do with it. By the time a measles vaccine rolled around in 1963, there were around 400 measles deaths in America, at a time when pockets of this country were still like a developing world, right? Where any infectious disease can kill children, right? When you have poor living conditions, anything can kill them. So it was already going out there. It was already rapidly declining. Measles deaths were going down. There were a few hundred. Enter the measles vaccine. And what it did is it broke the ecology with regards to measles. Whereas before you had a vaccine, children would typically get measles at the age range where it wasn't dangerous. It can be dangerous for babies. It can be dangerous for adults. The measles vaccine doesn't work as well as having actually had measles. And so babies don't get the same type of maternal antibodies. And adults can be infected to some degree because the vaccine doesn't offer the same type of lifetime protection. According to CDC FDA studies, also all in my book. So with that said, I'm not saying measles can't obviously harm children. It certainly can. But the story doesn't end there, because you got to look at the bigger picture. If you had a few hundred deaths, it was already declining on its own. What was the consequence of eliminating measles? And I mentioned to you earlier, those that have had measles have far less, for example, heart disease, a prospective, forward-looking, 100,000 person study in Japan, tracked the 100,000 people for 22 years, found a statistically significant decline in mortality from heart disease, a 20% decline. Heart disease kills 800,000 Americans a year. If eliminating measles would cause a part of that increase in heart disease, you are way upside down on your public health benefit from this product. Also, having measles reduces statistically significant in some studies Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, other cancers. Those kill children. 20,000 kids a year die of that. Again, if eliminating measles resulted in increasing some of those cancers, you're again, and here's the thing, most pathogens come and go over time. There might have been a reason this pathogen didn't leave us, Dr. Block. It may have stuck around because it conferred a survival advantage. Might just be the reason measles never was eliminated naturally, like a lot of pathogens that come and go.
No, it's an excellent point. I do a Dr. Fauci impression. I'm sorry. And I trot it out because I can. 2005, I have a few articles on Dr. Fauci and Brownstone, and I think there's Fauci 1.0 and Fauci 2.0. And I'm not sure there really was a genuinely pure 1.0, but I think 2.0 has been regulatory captured. In 2005, he was asked on a TV show, and it's recorded, you can find it, by a mom who says, look, I've had this year's flu. Should I now go get the flu shot? And he's like, of course not. You should not get the flu shot because you had the actual virus, which is a full, complete immunity. And why would you bother anyway? And this danger.
That's a pretty good impression, actually.
Thank you. That's why I do it. I mean, it's like, I have it, it's like being
right.
Anyway. But and plus I like doing it. Plus I think it's an excellent point on multiple levels, which is, this is exactly what he didn't say later on. It's like, you've had COVID, you still get the shot. This is not a thing. Prophylaxis, like, I don't want to get too lurid here, but your baby's 3 months old, you put a condom over your body. This is, it's just not doing what it's intended to do. There's a time, and one of those Psalms is a time for this, there's a time for the fact. Say, maybe you could quote it for me.
There's a time for peace. There's a time for war. There's a time for everything. But please.
Yeah, so it was I think, Crosby, Stills and Nash or Buffalo Springfield, whatever. One of those bands did it as well. But the point is, there's a time for vaccine. The actual vaccine is named for vaccinia, which is cowpox, and it was to prevent smallpox. And I think there's all well and good. George Washington's Continental Army, had to, cross-inoculate from cowpox to smallpox, so to keep his army from having that deleterious, disabling illness. And so that, maybe our country in part is formed, on the vaccinia vaccine in a sense. It wasn't really a term of art to call it vaccination at the time, but that's the basis of it. So I think there's a time for it, but they didn't do it after they got smallpox. That would be too late. And Dr. Fauci said this, and then, lo and behold, he said it early on in 2020, but then he changed his tune. And I think there's just been a connivance. And before we leave this aspect of before the fact, the after the fact, it's kind of too layered a question comes a diatribe, but maybe we could touch on the flu mist aspect. Are you aware of flu mist?
Sure, of course I'm familiar with it.
Right,
by the way, that wasn't vaccination. What George Washington ordered his troops to get. That was a violation. So essentially, it was giving them. It was actually you made a cut, or you took some of the thing and you inhaled it. You actually gave the person smallpox.
Well, it's a little bit like OPV. It's an attenuated version. The OPV is a polio vaccine. You're giving them a little bit of polio.
Yes, but they didn't get passage like OPV, which passage through monkey kidney cells over and over again. This was like you took a kid that had a scab, and they would just take some of it, either dry it out and then you'd inhale it, or they'd then scratch you and put it in. So it was actually just spreading smallpox. I mean, it was literally just giving you smallpox.
Well, but theoretically, the cowpox version thereof.
No. They gave you the pus from somebody that had smallpox is what, but that's the well, we don't need to get into that history. That doesn't matter. Anyway, what was the other point? I'm so sorry.
The separate point about, I had a primary care office for 30 years or so, maybe more. And, I used to, when I got the flu, it just put me out of business. And I was a solo guy. And so I wound up taking the flu shot because, it's just my own personal experimentation. I benefited from it. So I would take it religiously year after year. No pun intended with your book, Vaccine, Amen. But I found some benefit for it. But I think you have to pick out your age group. And flu mist was there theoretically for kids. And it's a, little nasal thing. You avoid the needle. Isn't that great? And so forth. And so it failed, though, as a product. I mean, it was a lot of money to get it over the hump. They did a lot more studies for flu mist because it was a new product, new formulation, all that kind of stuff. But lo and behold, kids didn't have any efficacy for it. And it dropped off because they didn't really notice kids did any better, vis-a-vis the flu. And I don't think they get that sick in the first place. So there's a couple different points there. Whether the flu shot is really worthwhile for other populations, I think it's reasonable for elderly and whatnot. But this kind of focus eternally on kids and getting kids vaccinated for things they don't get that sick from, A, and B, whether it bespeaks other aspects of having, a thing that actually does get studied, they don't show that much efficacy.
Well, look, on the flu miss, first I should say, we have many folks who've contacted our firm for their children who've been seriously injured by that product, as well as others. Okay. So that just gives you a good example. I mean, if they withdrew it for a while, like you said, on efficacy grounds, and of course, but they never talk about the serious harm it does cause a number of children. But let's put that aside. On the flu shot, there is something, the Corcoran collaboration, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is now essentially owned by Bill Gates. Not a person who's opposed to vaccines. And the Corcoran collaboration's own review, they do meta reviews, as your audience might know. They review all existing scientific literature to say, what does the science say on this topic? And so they did that for flu shots for children. And what they found was that they could not conclude that it does anything to prevent transmission, hospitalizations, or death. That is Bill Gates' own organization has reached that conclusion. But you know what that review, so does no efficacy for all flu shots, by the way, not just the flu miss one. But you know what else that review didn't discuss? It didn't discuss the series of studies that show that those who get the influenza vaccine have an increased rate of non-influenza type respiratory infections. There was the recent, I don't know if you saw it, out of the Cleveland Clinic. Did you see that study that showed that those that had influenza vaccine had an statistically increased rate of non-influenza infections? There's a whole number of those studies. I actually lay them all out in my book. So it's quite an interesting, it's really an interesting vaccine in that regard. The data to show that it's efficacious in preventing death, hospitalizations, or transmission of influenza, scant. However, studies showing that it actually increases the rate of non-respiratory, non-influenza type respiratory infections, a whole series of studies. It's always find it interesting. The studies, I can always tell you what studies are going to get noticed. Studies that tend to show that you should get more vaccine, touted. Studies that tend to show that there are issues that are going to result in more hospital visits of any kind, ignored. When you follow the money, you tend to see which way science often goes, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm going to devil's advocate you again,
Please.
because you're an advocate and you can take some advocacy in return.
I love it.
So as far as follow the money, so I like you. I think you're very forthright, knowledgeable. You're super knowledgeable about this aspect, and that's just incredible. I thought your testimony was awesome in that Senate subcommittee. But let's face it, we all like to get paid, and so is there kind of a moral hazard with money involved and benefits and damages and all that kind of stuff for families to take on certain aspects of symptoms, and how do we judge that? There's no perfect world where we can kind of divorce people from their ability to sue. I had a medical school class again back in the Paleozoic. Well, actually, it was after. It was while I was practicing doctor, and Martin Samuels, amazing guy, rest in peace, said that nobody's ever going to get better from back pain until he can really be rest assured that there's no further legal recourse for him to be recompensed, in those cases. And so it's kind of chiropractor syndrome. People will have their symptoms meet their potential payout. And so, given that we are human beings, we're not, I don't know, whatever you might test, we're not lab rats and so forth. How do we, find this perfect world where we can test people without the concept of, there's maybe, something for it, in it for me. And again, what about the attorneys? And then kind of, I'll save my second question. We'll come back to it. But the NCVAA was brought about in a sense because of tort claims and so forth around the vaccines pre-NCVAA.
Oh, happy to address that. Look, just to make sure your audience understands this, vaccines are the only product in the United States, the only one that has immunity for what they call design defect claims, which is the claim that you could have made the product safer, and had you done so, I wouldn't have been injured, which is the primary claim you would bring for if you're injured by a product. You can sue for any other product, drugs, planes, cars. your floorboards, every single chemical that's in your walls, that's on your bed sheets, you name it. Look around your room right now and that you're sitting in. Everything you're surrounded by is a product, everything. And you could sue the manufacturer to claim that that product could have been made safer if it injures you. There is only one product in America you can't sue on that basis. And those are childhood vaccines. Those are vaccines they tell you, assure you, promise you, tell you over and over again, safe and effective, safe and effective. But yet they need that immunity. Let me put this in sharp contrast, okay, Dr. Bach. Drugs for really small populations that are only taken by very few people that have bad adverse effects are still profitable on the market. Why? Because to protect yourself from liability, this idea that you could just bring a lawsuit and get money, trust me, it's not the case. To protect yourself from liability, a drug company essentially has to do two things. Number one, make it as technologically feasible, as safe as technologically feasible. Then you can't bring a design defect claim. You said, look, I made it as safe as I could based on existing technology. I couldn't make it any safer. No design defect claims. Two, disclose all the risks. Then you can't bring a failure to warn claim. Those are the two claims you typically bring: design defect, failure to warn. So make it as safe as you can, disclose all the risks, and you're generally protected from liability. That's how small drugs that hurt a lot of people still survive in the market. You want to tell me that with vaccines, where they're mandated, millions of kids get it every single year, where there's free publicity by the federal government, and where they're guaranteed payment by the Children's Vaccine Program, they can't turn a profit without immunity? Come on. Let me tell you something. Something's really broken. Let me tell you my definition of a vaccine. My definition of vaccine is not that it prevents transmission, because some do, some don't. It's not whether, it's a subunit or it's this. My definition of vaccine is a product that causes so much harm, it cannot survive on the market without federal government giving immunity to prevent people from suing for the injuries and deaths that it causes. That's my definition of vaccine. Quite the contrary, safe and effective, I know. Very sacrilegious, but I assure you, you read my book, I think you might not disagree with the way I view the world.
No, I've read a decent portion of it, and I have not read it in full, so I haven't gotten to that full formulation. Again, no pun intended. But so,
by the way, just to say, I'm not saying lawyers are. I've taken many issues with the legal profession, to no doubt. Yeah, but on that point, this is not a product of lawyer issues. This is a product of the product of the issues with the product itself. Well,
I personally am a product of a lawyer issue, and my dad was an attorney, and at some point,
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, we got me, it was, I guess, somewhat hereditary. My brother's an attorney, and for some reason, my brother-in-law as well. Anyway, so I have nothing really against attorneys as a class, but I got a lot of lawyer jokes. I'll spare both of us.
Okay.
But it's an interesting claim because, again, there were some vaccines, and the NCVIA was brought about because vaccine manufacturers dropped out one after the other. And I've spoken with Dr. Robert Malone about some of this aspect, and he points out a lot of the ones that are extant currently have been grandfathered in on kind of these primordial, like 1960s technologies, making vaccines not quite in a bathtub, not like moonshine, whatever, but they haven't really been brought up to speed for regular technology because they have this kind of grandfather. They don't want to have to reprove it, whatever. So they're working on. So I kind of support your concept a little bit that they're working on poor studies.
Which ones are grandfathered in? I mean, really, the only one that still exists after 1986 is MMR. DTP is gone. OPV is gone. Everything else on the schedule is new since 86.
Right. Well, maybe he was pointing about that. We just conversed on the telephone. I have not been able to follow up all his thoughts, but I just
no
put that out. But so the little old lady who swallowed the fly, she had to eat the spider to catch the fly, and then she ate the mouse to catch the spider, et cetera, et cetera. So we keep making contrivances and contraptions to contravene the previous problems and so forth. So I'm kind of a free market guy, but medicine tends not to work as a strict free market. It's kind of what I call the paternal model. It's a little bit like you're a teenager, even if you're 50, 60 years old, whatever, you're kind of the teenager. You have to ask your dad, i.e. the doctor, I want this, and no, you may not, or yes, you may, whatever. And so we don't really have a free market. We don't really pay cash. It's not like buying your shoes, your coat, houseplant or whatever, the same way. We don't have that kind of same free market aspect. And a lot of this, I think, gets kind of hidden in the fact that we're not really making informed choices. We're kind of like, again, we're the kids getting what the doctor says. And the doctors had that kind of Marcus Welby oriented aura above us. But anyway, so to wit, we have an imperfect marketplace in this, what I call paternal model of economics in medicine. And then there's all this buffering through insurance companies. Again, you're not really paying cash like you buy your car or whatever. So how much of the market could be fixed for vaccines, if any? And is there anything worth salvaging from this? And is the pre-NCVA death of the companies willing to produce vaccines pathognomonic, as we say in medicine? Is it indicative of a failed product or a failed marketplace? And is there any way getting back to anything from that?
There should be the normal market incentives to make a safe product. And not only to make sure it's safe before you put it on, afterwards. Let's look at drugs again. Drugs are often licensed based on multi-year placebo-controlled trials. Why? Because the drug companies want to know whether it's safe before it goes to market. Because if it's not safe, they're going to have to pay damages and they could end up losing money. They have an economic self-interest to make sure that the clinical trials are robust before it goes to market. But with childhood vaccines, which is why you see days, weeks, ridiculous clinical trials, they don't have that incentive. In fact, they have the opposite incentive to find as few safety issues as possible before they get it to market so they can make billions of dollars. This is not, you can characterize it with whatever adjective you want. The adjective I use, that's business. They're publicly traded companies. That is how business works. You want the business to make decisions based on what's like moral and ethical. That's not how corporations work. They do things based on the fastest and least path of resistance to making money. I've represented corporate America for a decade before I went and did this. That's, at one of the biggest law firms in the country. And forget my personal experience. Anybody in the corporate world will tell you that. If you went into a boardroom and the members of the board said, you know what, we're not going to do what makes the company the most money. We're going to do what's moral. What do you think is going to happen? Okay. So my point is that is why that is why you end up with the clinical trials you do between vaccines and drugs. That's why you end up with the differential in the post-licensure environment in terms of safety. So yes, I think that eliminating the immunity given to the vaccine manufacturers, so they have to just be like every other product out there. That doesn't mean, by the way, that shouldn't mean there are no more vaccines. After all, Dr. Bach, they're safe.
Yeah.
What do you have to worry about? They've been telling us for decades they're safe. Yeah. So if they're safe, there's no concern. They don't need the immunity. Yeah. Or do that.
It's an interesting point.
I'll just add this. And look, here's the thing. Vaccines are just a product. It's not like nobody says to me, do you think cars are good or bad? You for or against cars? I'm not for or against cars. I'm not like it's good or it's bad. It's a car. I'm not for or against vaccines. I don't think they're good or they're bad. They're a product. Let the companies have to stand behind them. Just because you eliminate the immunity doesn't mean that all vaccines are going to go per se. It just means those that are a problem are, and let them go make a better one, a safer one.
No, you're absolutely right. I was invited by a friend of mine who's a Harvard Business School professor to attend a class, and because I'm kind of a free market kind of guy, and he is too, I believe. And so the topic was rent control. So they do this case study technique, 2-hour class, and very, very bright people in the room. I think I lowered the IQ just by walking in. Anyway, he I grew up in rent-controlled apartment in New York City. And so for us, it was great, whatever. But the woman who was there was the spearhead to undo the rent control statutes in Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge, which are like, the focus urban area in Massachusetts, the urban area. And she succeeded in 1993 or 4. And, everybody then, I was in Boston at the time, and I had grown up in rent control. So I had kind of an affinity for this, topic. And everyone was like, Chicken Little, the sky's going to fall. We're going to get rid of rent control. Everyone's going to, they're going to raise the rents massively. Everyone's going to get kicked out. Anyway, all these can't even say it, apocalyptic visions about what happened. Like instantaneously, like Javier Milei in Argentina, he did the same thing. He got rid of all these rent control statutes. Lo and behold, rents went down like, I think they said 184% went down, whatever that means, but cut by half, I guess. And there's more units on the market. People are building like crazy, and everyone's happy like nuts. And same thing happened in Cambridge. It got beautiful all of a sudden. Cambridge was derelict. This Harvard, which looks nice, a lot of things were kind of buoying it up. Whatever, there's some nice spots in Cambridge at the time, but in the 80s, it was a pretty, kind of slushy place. Nobody wanted to take care of the homes, so you got rid of rent control. Anyway, I don't want to carry this too far. Yeah. But the analogy is there. It's kind of the Soviet model, and you get used to. A lot of people still want to be Soviet in Russia. A lot of people, they're probably aging out now, but during the 2000s or whatever, there are a lot of people who were like nostalgic and wistful for the Soviet Union because everything was controlled and tight, and there was one product, one place, all that kind of stuff. But I think people move beyond that. Once you kind of get the free market working in, then people can kind of do what they want. They can vote with their feet and all that kind of stuff. You can see you have much more kind of like a greater landscape of parameters and kind of a poly space of the right place to be. And it's not necessarily, having this kind of one thing, one size fits all. It doesn't work in Soviet land. It didn't work anywhere else. It doesn't work for vaccines, and people they've accused me of being anti-vaccine. And the analogy I came up with is that, like, look, I'm not anti-clothing. I just think that you don't wear your parka to the beach. You don't wear your bathing suit skiing. Like you pick and choose what it is you want for the situation. I might very well, if I'm going to Nigeria in the jungle, whatever, I might very well get a yellow fever vaccine. I'd have to look into it, all that kind of stuff. But, Steve Kirsch was on my show and he was heading out that way. Like the topic came up. I don't know if he did or didn't, whatever. But it's a thing, you have to look at it and investigate and decide if that's the right thing for you. I think, there's doctors and lawyers, attorneys, I point out even O.J. Simpson, derelict that he was in a sense, and criminal and a murderer, he got a team of lawyers and they all were working for him and they got him off, whatever, some in part and so forth. And when people go see doctors, is that doctor giving the same kind of devotion that, Dershowitz and Cochran gave to O.J. Simpson? I don't think so. They have this kind of other ear. They're listening to the state and their peers and whatnot, and they are pretty much, again, to your religion point, which I think is a not unreasonable part. They have another master, and I think that speaking of advocacy, I think patients deserve advocacy from their physician. They deserve a kind of attorney privilege, doctor privilege, and they should be looking out for those patients, and that means tailoring. It might even mean thinking.
I depose pediatricians regularly, and it's I go real soft because they really know nothing about vaccines for the most part. They literally know nothing. The IT doctors know virtually nothing. Immunologists know virtually nothing. I mean, the only ones that really know some modicum about vaccines are the vaccinologists, and you can watch my depositions of the world's leading vaccinologists, and you could see what they know.
I didn't watch all 9 hours of Stanley Plotkin, but that was incredibly eye-opening. Yeah. I was listening to your one with, what's her name? Edwards, what's her?
Dr. Catherine Edwards.
Yeah, she's one of the godmother of vaccines.
Well, the standard textbook, the medical textbook, is called Plotkin's Vaccines, and it's got 4 editors, which is Dr. Plotkin, Catherine Edwards, Paul Offit, and Dr. Orenstein. So, I've deposed 2 of them. I've had run-ins with Offit on Twitter and Substack, and you can read those exchanges. I think those are quite eye-opening too. But if I could hit on one of the points that you made about anti-vaxxer, you've been called an anti-vaxxer, and you make, obviously, yeah, it's like, are you anti-car? It's like to the same point I made before. But I'll tell you something really interesting, because I'd actually asked on national television, I had Shannon Breen said, but you're not anti-vax, right? And here's what I said to her when I was on national TV on the spot. I said, look, Merriam-Webster defines somebody who's anti-vax, if you look it up, anti-vaxxer, as somebody who opposes one or more vaccines or mandate of a vaccine, okay? And I said to her that, look, half the country right now opposes getting the flu vaccine, the COVID vaccine, and half the country doesn't want to get the flu shot, and more than half the country doesn't want to mandate those vaccines either. And so under the dictionary definition, more than half the country right now is a dictionary definition anti-vaxxer. I mean, literally. And Merriam-Webster, they draw their definitions of terms from, as you may know, from those that use it, right? Mm-hmm. They try to take it out of the vernacular. And those who are the fanatics on this topic, those the proponents of vaccination, they have gone so far in their view of this and beliefs. They've essentially painted, according to the Merriam-Webster editors, over half the country with this term, which of course at this point renders it meaningless. Right. But if opposing one or more vaccines makes you an anti-vaxxer, then there's a lot of anti-vaxxers.
Well, this has been lovely. I am very much honored to have been in the same virtual room as you. I don't know what else to say except give you a chance to kind of sum things up and give us the landscape of what you intend. And I guess a side question would be, again, on the lawyer basis, what is your firm getting from this? I mean, what's your motivation? And we all want to make profit and whatnot, but where's the pathway given the NCVIA currently? If it were lifted, would there be any retroactive,
Sure,
tortious openings?
Yeah, well, our firm has over 100 folks in it, and half the firm does plaintiff side class actions, nothing to do with vaccines, because obviously we have to make money. The other half does vaccine related work, and portion of those, like 15 of those do bring claims in the vaccine injury compensation program, which we talked about earlier, where we sue the secretary of HHS if you are injured by a vaccine. Mm-hmm. But it's not like a regular court. You don't get, usually you would get to depose the company, get doc discovery. You don't get any of that. It's a limited program. We can get some limited compensation for certain limited injuries. And so we have attorneys that do that. We also have attorneys that help folks with exemptions, school, work, as well as immigration. Those are also, just something we started doing as an outgrowth of our vaccine policy work. We also help folks who've been fired by vaccines. That's also been an outgrowth of our policy work. But at the core of all of that vaccine work, it really just started as doing vaccine policy work. It really just started as a practice seeking to protect the individual and civil rights of those who, for one or another reason, don't want to take these products. You want to get them, great. Get as many as you want. But for those who choose not to, this was, where this was the core of what the vaccine work. And most of that work is funded by the Informed Consent Action Network and ICANN, which is a nonprofit. They provide some funding for it, and that supports the policy work. And then we have the other vaccine stuff that I described around it. Those are not growth practices. Those are intended, to affect change. Our policy work is never driven by. We don't bring lawsuits on the policy work based on financial reward. We do them based on impact. In fact, if there is money in it, we don't touch it typically on the policy side because other lawyers will do it. They'll go after it. So the type of lawsuits that we typically bring on vaccines are typically ones that nobody would ever bring because there's no real money in it, or the risk is just so great nobody would do it. Like challenging the lack of religious exemptions to attend school without a vaccine in the state of Mississippi, which we were able to win and restore religious exemption there, for example. No firm would bring that case. For money, it would be considered. There's no risk benefit calculation that would ever make sense to bring that case. But we get some financial support again from ICANN that makes that possible. And then we have the other side of the firm that that does other type of work.
So is there? I keep coming up with last questions, but
that's okay.
Is there a possibility of the NCVIA repeal?
Look, with 1,000+ lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry over there in Congress, and as far as I know, 0 registered lobbyists that would seek, for vaccine safety. I think the chances are basically 0.
So we're kind of stuck with this formulation forever. Or?
I think that there's 2 things that can get us there. One is if enough folks, there is a tipping point where enough people in the public understand the issue, and that it becomes impossible for the legislative representatives to ignore it. It requires a lot. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book, Vaccines Amen, is to help educate folks so they can see this as a product, not an item of worship. because that's what most people are trained to say. Wait, you don't believe in
I
vaccines?
know. No, you don't believe in it.
Nobody says you don't believe in cars? You don't believe in pencils? You don't believe in chairs? Nobody says that because it's silly. But people say, I believe in vaccines all the time because that really carries a truism, because most of what people know about vaccines is based on belief. That's why when you challenge them on it, they often react emotionally because they're not drawing from their intellect or knowledge. They're drawing from their emotions because they have no place else to draw from. And that's why I wrote this thing. I spent a lot of time writing it. I spent 3 years writing it, and it really
it's fabulous.
And precisely to like help people get
Yeah.
to be able to understand this thing as a product.
Yeah.
And the more people that do, then you maybe have a chance. The other thing, and God, I hope this never is the reason, but if there's a cataclysmic event, if something really bad happens with a vaccine at some point in the future, that could potentially drive, but that would drive the awakening that then could get there. But I hope that we never get to that spot.
Yeah. So while we're showing books, I don't have your book up. I can put it up, but people, it's Vaccines. This is my book here. People can buy it on Amazon. No pun intended, because it happened in Brazil. Kind of think it's amusing. I'm selling it on Amazon. But it's even better if they read it and shovel money to me. But the thing that maybe offline we could get your attention on this is that there's $1 billion got poured in 2016 towards Zika microcephaly. Even after the thing had disappeared in Brazil, Fauci pushed it by September 2016. There was issues because it involved promoting abortion in South America. So that was kind of the moral issue at the time with the Republican Congress. Anyway, he kind of stole money he literally announced it. He was taking money from cancer and other diabetes and whatnot to do it anyway. You're not going to put money in, I'm going to do it. I left out my Fauci imitation for that. But there's still money around because the virus didn't cooperate in causing microcephaly. So there's still $500 million of remnants of that to make a vaccine. And actually, ironically, Bill Gates in 2017, he had $100 million that he was going to put as long as they make an mRNA version of the Zika vaccine. And again, the virus didn't cooperate. It's not a real thing, in my view. It's not a real Zika microcephaly. There's no real connection there. But it was all kind of put the cart in front of the horse, or maybe the other way around, to get this mRNA modality in. And I think a lot of these things we're getting experimented on. So I'm with you on kind of the way we've been guinea pigged into being, test templates for virus, vaccine manufacturers to make a fortune. Obviously, they did Moderna, Pfizer, and so forth, AstraZeneca on this last, COVID thing. But to my point, Dr. Fauci's own wife was against human challenge trials, which means you inject somebody with that thing because of Guatemala and all that kind of stuff. And she's an bioethicist. And even so, and in 2017, there was a Zika conclave of ethicists, bioethicists, which may be an oxymoron, to decide whether they should do that with Zika. And they said no, because you can have mosquito, even stipulating it A causes B. They said when you've got mosquito netting, it's not that bad, it's not fatal, blah, blah, blah. No, you shouldn't inject people. Anyway, lo and behold, he kept trying to do it. In 2018 in Brazil, he offered $100 million. They turned it down because the thing had disappeared. And he did it in Baltimore over the last 2-3 years in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And they injected infected women with the Zika vaccine. And they're going to have a Zika vaccine. So this is not really a legal case yet. But I kind of feel there's got to be a way to forestall having that out on the market. That's a question out of the blue. You're welcome to punt on this one.
My only interest would be that if they do it, proper clinical trial, don't mandate it, don't give it immunity, treat it like any other product. Well, look, there are all kinds of products out there that harm people that are pretty useless as well. And, people can choose to take it or not take it, caveat emptor. So, my view of it would be, as long as, but just if you're going to put the FDA stamp of approval on it, if you're going to put a government stamp of approval on it, make sure it's properly trialed. And if the CDC is then going to recommend it, make sure they do post-licensure safety that's appropriate. And there should be no immunity and there should no mandates.
Yeah,
that'd be my view of it.
Fair enough. So it's an incredible irony that these vaccine companies are always getting immunity, which they may or may not provide in their products. It's kind of funny.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of memes out there. The only real immunity is the immunity the manufacturers get for the injuries they cause rather than the immunity the vaccine supposedly gives you. For some of them. It depends which vaccine. Obviously, I mean, I lay it out in detail in chapter 9 of my book about how most vaccines actually don't even prevent transmission. It's just like COVID vaccine.
All right. Well, this has been a joy. Stick around for 1 minute after this, but we're going to say goodbye to everybody else.